9. Author's forward. Author here, meaning the real author, the living human holding the pencil, not some abstract narrative persona. Granted, there sometimes is such a persona in The Pale King, but that's mainly a pro forma statutory construct, an entity that exists just for legal and commercial purposes, rather like a corporation. It has no direct, provable connection to me as a person. But this right here is me as a real person, David Wallace, age 40, Social Security number 97504-2012. Note: little known fact. The only U.S. citizens anywhere whose Social Security numbers start with the numeral 9 are those who are, or at some time were, contract employees of the Internal Revenue Service. Through its special relationship with the Social Security Administration, the IRS issues you a new SS number on the day your contract starts. It's like you're born again, ID-wise, when you enter the service. Very few ordinary citizens know about this. There's no reason they should. But consider your own Social Security number, or those of the people close enough to you that you're entrusted with their SS. There's only one digit that these SS numbers never start with. That number is 9. 9's reserved for the service. And if you're issued one, it stays with you for the rest of your life, even if you happen to have left the IRS long ago. It sort of marks you, numerically. Every April, and quarterly, of course, for those who are self-employed and pay quarterly ESTs, those tax returns and ESTs whose filers' SS numbers start with 9 are automatically pulled and routed through a special processing and exam program in the Martinsburg Computer Center. Your status in the system is forever altered. The service knows its own. Always. End note. Addressing you from my Form 8829 deductible home office at 725 Indian Hill Boulevard, Claremont 91711, California, on this 5th day of spring, 2005, to inform you of the following. All of this is true. This book is really true. I obviously need to explain. First, please flip back and look at the book's legal disclaimer, which is on the copyright page, verso side, 4 leaves in from the rather unfortunate and misleading front cover. The disclaimer is the unindented chunk that starts, "The characters and events in this book are fictitious." I'm aware that ordinary citizens almost never read disclaimers like this, the same way we don't bother to look at copyright claims or Library of Congress specs or any of the dull pro forma boilerplate on sales contracts and ads that everyone knows is there just for legal reasons. But now I need you to read it, the disclaimer, and to understand that its initial, "the characters and events in this book," includes this very author's foreword. In other words, this foreword is defined by the disclaimer as itself fictional, meaning that it lies within the area of special legal protection established by that disclaimer. I need this legal protection in order to inform you that what follows... Note. This is a term of art. What I really mean is that everything that surrounds this foreword is essentially true. The foreword, having now been moved 79 pages into the text, is due to yet another spasm of last-minute caution on the part of the publisher, which please see just below. End note, is in reality not fiction at all, but substantially true and accurate. That, The Pale King, is, in point of fact, more like a memoir than any kind of made-up story. This might appear to set up an irksome paradox. The book's legal disclaimer defines everything that follows it as fiction, including this foreword. But now here in this foreword, I'm saying that the whole thing is really non-fiction. So if you believe one, you can't believe the other, etc., etc. Please know that I find these sorts of cute, self-referential paradoxes irksome, too. At least now that I'm over 30, I do. And that the very last thing this book is some kind of clever metafictional titty pincher. That's why I'm making it a point to violate protocol and address you here directly, as my real self. That's why all the specific identifying data about me as a real person got laid out at the start of this foreword, so that I could inform you of the truth. The only bona fide fiction here is the copyright page's disclaimer, which again is a legal device. The disclaimer's whole and only purpose is to protect me, the book's publisher, and the publisher's assigned distributors from legal liability. The reason why such protections are especially required here, why in fact the publisher... Note. At the advice of its corporate counsel, the publishing company has declined to be identified by name in this author's foreword, despite the fact that anyone who looks at the book's spine or title page will know immediately who the company is, meaning it's an irrational constraint, but so be it. As my own counsel has observed, corporate attorneys are not paid to be totally rational, but they are paid to be totally cautious, and it is not hard to see why a registered US corporation like this book's publisher is going to be cautious about even the possibility of appearing to thumb its nose at the Internal Revenue Service, or, this from some of the corporate counsel's hysterical early memos, to be abetting an author's violation of the non-disclosure covenant that all Treasury employees are required to sign. Nevertheless, as my lawyer and I had to point out to them about 105 times before the company's counsel seemed to get it, the version of the non-disclosure covenant that's binding on all Treasury employees, not just on agents of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms and of the Secret Service, as formerly was instituted in 1987, which happens to be the year that computers and a high-powered statistical formula known as the ANADA for Audit No Audit Discriminant Algorithm were first used in the examination of nearly all individual US tax returns. I know that's a pretty involved and confusing data dump to inflict on you in a mere forward, but the crux here is that it is the ANADA subnote. By the way, no kidding about the formula's name. Were the technical branch statisticians aware that they were giving the algorithm such a heavy, almost thanatonoid-sounding acronym? It's actually doubtful. As all too many Americans now know, computerized programs are totally, maddeningly literal and non-connotative, and so are the people in technical branch. End subnote. And the constituents of its formula for determining which tax returns are most apt to yield additional revenue under audit that the service is concerned to protect. And that was why the non-disclosure covenant was suddenly extended to IRS employees in 1987. But I had already left the service in 1987. The worst of a certain personal unpleasantness had blown over, and I'd been accepted for transfer at another college, and by autumn of 1986 I was back on the East Coast and again up and running in the private sector, albeit, of course, still with my new SS number. My entire IRS career lasted from May 1985 through June 1986, hence my exemption from the covenant, not to mention that I was hardly in a position to know anything compromising or specific about the ANADA. My service post was totally low-level and regional. For the bulk of my time, I was a rote examiner, aka a wiggler in the service nomenclature. My contracted civil service rank was a GS9, which at that time was the lowest full-time grade. There were secretaries and custodians who outranked me. And I was posted to Peoria, Illinois, which is about as far from 666 and the Martinsburg Center as anyone could imagine. Admittedly, at the same time, and this is what especially concerned the publishing company's counsel, Peoria was a REC, one of 7 hubs of the IRS's examination division, which was precisely the division that got eliminated, or more accurately, though this is arguable, transferred from the compliance branch to the newly expanded technical branch by the advent of the ANADA and the digital Fornix network. This is rather more esoteric, contextless service information than I'd anticipated having to ask you to swallow right at the beginning, and I can assure you that all this gets explained and or unfolded in much more graceful, dramatically apposite terms in the memoir itself, once it gets underway. For now, just so you're not totally flummoxed and bored, suffice it to say that examinations is the IRS division tasked with combing and culling various kinds of tax returns and classifying some as 20s, which is service shorthand for tax returns that are to be forwarded to the relevant district office for audit. Audits themselves are conducted by revenue agents, who are usually GS9s or 11s, and employed by the audit division. It's hard to put all this very smoothly or gracefully, and please know that none of this abstract information is all that vital to the mission of this forward, so feel free to skip or skim the following if you wish, and don't think the whole book will be like this, because it won't be. If you're burningly interested, though, each tax return pulled, for whatever reasons, some of which were smart and discerning, and others, frankly, wacko and occult, depending on the wiggler, by a line examiner and forwarded for audit is supposed to be accompanied by an IRS Series 20 internal memo, which is where the term 20 comes from. Like most insular, and let's be frank, despised government agencies, the service is rife with special jargon and code that seems overwhelming at first, but then gets internalized so quickly and used so often that it becomes almost habitual. I still sometimes dream in service speak. To return to the point, though, examinations and audits were 2 of the main divisions of the IRS's compliance branch, and the publishing company's House counsel's concern was that the IRS's own counsel could, if they were sufficiently aggrieved and wanted to make trouble over the non-disclosure covenant thing, argue that I and several of the post-047 RAC co-workers and administrators who feature in the story should be grandfathered in under the constraints of the non-disclosure covenant, because we were not only employed by the compliance branch, but posted at the RAC that ended up figuring so prominently in the run-up to what came to be known variously as the new IRS, the Spackman Initiative, or just the initiative, which was ostensibly created by the Tax Reform Act of 1986, but was actually the result of a long, very complicated bureaucratic catfight between the compliance branch and the technical branch over examinations and the exam function in IRS operations. End of datadom. If you're still reading, I hope enough of all that made sense for you to at least understand why the issue of whether or not I explicitly say the name of the publishing company was not one that I chose to spend a lot of time and editorial goodwill arguing about. You sort of have to pick your battles as far as nonfiction goes. End note. Has insisted upon them as a precondition for acceptance of the manuscript and payment of the advance. Is the same reason the disclaimer is, when you come right down to it, a lie. Note. Accepting the all rights reserved part, of course. End note. What follows is substantially true and accurate. At least, it's a mainly true and accurate partial record of what I saw and heard and did, of whom I knew and worked alongside and under, and of what all eventuated at IRS Post 047, the Midwest Regional Examination Center, Peoria, Illinois, in 1985 to 86. Much of the book is actually based on several different notebooks and journals I kept during my 30 months as a rote examiner at the Midwest RAC. Based means more or less lifted right out of, for reasons that will doubtless become clear. The Pale King is, in other words, a kind of vocational memoir. It is also supposed to function as a portrait of a bureaucracy, arguably the most important federal bureaucracy in American life, at a time of enormous internal struggle and soul-searching, the birth pains of what's come to be known among tax professionals as the new IRS. In the interests of full disclosure, though, I should be explicit and say that the modifier in substantially true and accurate refers not just to the inevitable subjectivity and bias of any memoir. The truth is that there are, in this non-fiction account, some slight changes and strategic rearrangements, most of these evolving through successive drafts in response to feedback from the book's editor, who was sometimes put in a very delicate position with respect to balancing literary and journalistic priorities, on the one hand, against legal and corporate concerns on the other. That's probably all I should say on that score. There is, of course, a whole tortuous backstory here involving the legal vetting of the manuscript's final 3 drafts, but you will be spared having to hear much about all this, if for no other reason than that relating that inside story would defeat the very purpose of the repetitive, microscopically cautious vetting process, and of all the myriad little changes and rearrangements to accommodate those changes that became necessary when, e.g., certain people declined to sign legal releases, or when one mid-sized company threatened legal action if its real name or identifying details of its actual past tax situation were used, disclaimer or no. Note. This latter is a good example of the sort of thing that threw the publisher's legal people into a swivet of anality and caution. People often don't understand how seriously large U.S. corporations take even a threat of litigation. As I eventually realized, it's not even so much a question of whether or not the publisher would lose a lawsuit. What really concerns them is the cost of defending against it, and the effect of those costs on the company's liability insurance premiums, which are already a major operating expense. Legal trouble is, in other words, a bottom-line issue, and the editor or in-house counsel who exposes a publishing company to possible legal liability had better be able to demonstrate to his CFO that every last reasonable bit of caution and due diligence was exercised on the manuscript, lest he wear what we in exams used to call the brown helmet. At the same time, it isn't fair to attribute every last tactical change and deviation here to the publisher. I, meaning again the actual human David Wallace, also fear litigation. Like many Americans, I've been sued, twice in fact, though both suits were meritless and one was dismissed as frivolous before I was even deposed. And I know what so many of us know. Litigation is no fun, and it's worth one's time and trouble to try to head it off in advance whenever possible. Plus, of course, looming over the whole vetting and due diligence process on the Pale King was the shadow of the service, which no one in his right mind would ever even dream of wanting to piss off unnecessarily, or actually even to come to the full institutional attention of, since the service, like civil litigation, can make your life miserable without ever getting one extra dime from you. End note. In the final analysis, though, there are a lot fewer of these small, identity-obscuring changes and temporal rearrangements than one might have expected. For there are advantages to limiting a memoir's range to one single interval, plus relevant backstories, in what seems to us all now like the distant past. People don't much care anymore, for one thing, by which I mean people in this book. The publishing company's paralegals had far less trouble getting signed legal releases than counsel had predicted. The reasons for this have varied, but as my own lawyer and I had argued ahead of time, obvious. Of the persons named, described, and even sometimes projected into the consciousness of his so-called characters in The Pale King, a majority have now left the service. Of those remaining, several have reached levels of GS rank where they are more or less invulnerable. Note: e.g., one is now an Assistant Regional Commissioner for Taxpayer Assistance in the Western Regional Commissioner's Office at Oxnard, California. End note. Also, because of the time of year when drafts of the book were presented for their perusal, I am confident that certain other service personnel were so busy and distracted that they did not really even read the manuscript, and after waiting a decent interval to give the impression of close study and deliberation, signed the legal release so that they could feel they had one less thing they were supposed to do. A few also seemed flattered at the prospect of someone's having paid them enough notice to be able, years later, to remember their contributions. A handful signed because they have remained, through the years, my personal friends. One of these is probably the most valuable, profound friend I've ever made. Some are dead, turned out to be incarcerated, of which one of these was someone you never would have thought or suspected. Not everyone signed legal releases. I don't mean to suggest that, only that most did. Several also consented to be interviewed on record. Where appropriate, parts of their tape-recorded responses have been transcribed directly into the text. Others have graciously signed additional releases authorizing the use of certain audiovisual recordings of them that were made in 1984 as part of an abortive IRS Personnel Division motivational and recruitment effort. Note: a signed, notarized 2002 FOIA request for copies of these videotapes is on file at the Internal Revenue Service's Office of Public Information, 666 Independence Avenue, Washington, D.C. And yes, the service's national HQ's street number really is 666. So far as I know, it's nothing more than an unfortunate accident in the Treasury Department's assignment of office space after the 16th Amendment was ratified in 1913. On the regional levels, service personnel tend to refer to the national office as 666. The meaning of the term is obvious, though no one I was able to talk to seemed to know just when it came into use. End note. As an aggregate, they have provided reminiscences and concrete details that, when combined with the techniques of reconstructive journalism, note. This loose term is meant to connote the dramatized reconstruction of an empirically real occurrence. It is a common and wholly respectable modern device used in both film, QV, The Thin Blue Line, Forrest Gump, JFK, and literature, QV, Capote's in Cold Blood, Ooks, The Kane Mutiny, Oates' Zombie, Crane's The Red Badge of Courage, Wolf's The Right Stuff, etc., etc. End note. Have yielded scenes of immense authority and realism, regardless of whether this author was actually corporeally right there on the scene at the time or not. The point I'm trying to drive home here is that it's still all substantially true, i.e. the book this forward is part of, regardless of the various ways some of the forthcoming sections have to be distorted, depersonalized, polyphonized, or otherwise jazzed up in order to conform to the specs of the legal disclaimer. This is not to say that this jazzing up is all just gratuitous titty-pinching. Given the aforementioned legal/commercial constraints, it's ended up being integral to the book's whole project. The idea, as both sides' counsel worked it out, is that you will regard features like shifting POVs, structural fragmentation, willed incongruities, etc., as simply the modern literary analogues of Once Upon a Time, or Far, Far Away There Once Dwelt, or any of the other traditional devices that signaled the reader that what was underway was fiction and should be processed accordingly. For as everyone knows, whether consciously or not, there's always a kind of unspoken contract between a book's author and its reader, and the terms of this contract always depend on certain codes and gestures that the author deploys in order to signal the reader what kind of book it is, i.e. whether it's made up versus true. And these codes are important because the subliminal contract for nonfiction is very different from the one for fiction. Note: the main way you can tell that the contracts are different is from our reactions to their breach. The feeling of betrayal or infidelity that the reader suffers if it turns out that a piece of ostensible non-fiction has made up stuff in it, as has been revealed in some recent literary scandals, e.g. Kosinski's Painted Bird or that infamous Casa Terra book, is because the terms of the non-fiction contracts have been violated. Some fireworks. There are, of course, ways to quote-unquote cheat the reader in fiction, too, but these tend to be more technical, meaning internal to the story's own formal rules. See, for example, the mystery novel's first-person narrator who doesn't reveal that he's actually the murderer until the last page, even though he obviously knew it all along and suppressed it just to jerk us around. And the reader tends to feel more aesthetically disappointed than personally dicked over. End note. What I'm trying to do right here, within the protective range of the copyright page's disclaimer, is to override the unspoken codes and to be 100% overt and forthright about the present contract's terms. The Pale King is basically a non-fiction memoir, with additional elements of reconstructive journalism, organizational psychology, elementary civics, and tax theory, etc. Our mutual contract here is based on the presumptions of A, my veracity, and B, your understanding that any features or semions that might appear to undercut that veracity are in fact protective legal devices, not unlike the boilerplate that accompanies sweepstakes and civil contracts, and thus are not meant to be decoded or read so much as merely acquiesced to as part of the cost of our doing business together, so to speak, in today's commercial climate. Note. Apologies for the preceding sentence, which is the product of much haggling and compromise with the publisher's legal team. End note. Plus, there's the autobiographical fact that, like so many other nerdy, disaffected young people of that time, I dreamed of becoming an artist, i.e. somebody whose adult job was original and creative instead of tedious and drone-like. My specific dream was of becoming an immortally great fiction writer, a la Gaddis or Anderson, Balzac or Perec, etc., and many of the notebook entries on which parts of this memoir are based were themselves literarily jazzed up and fractured. It's just the way I saw myself at the time. In some ways, you could say that my literary ambitions were the chief reason I was on hiatus from college and working at the Midwest RAC at all, though most of that whole backstory is tangential and will be addressed only here in the foreword, and very briefly. To wit, in a nutshell, the truth is that the first pieces of fiction I was ever actually paid for involved certain other students at the initial college I went to, which was extremely expensive and highbrow and attended mainly by graduates of elite private schools in New York and New England. Without going into a whole lot of detail, let's just say that there were certain pieces of prose I produced for certain students on certain academic subjects, and that these pieces were fictional in the sense of having styles, theses, scholarly personas, and authorial names that were not my own. I think you get the idea. The chief motivation behind this little enterprise was, as it so often is in the real world, financial. It's not like I was desperately poor in college, but my family was far from wealthy, and part of my financial aid package involved taking out large student loans. And I was aware that student loan debt tended to be very bad news for someone who wanted to pursue any sort of artistic career after college, since it's well known that most artists toil in aesthetic obscurity for years before making any real money at their profession. On the other hand, there were many students at that college whose families were in a position not only to pay their whole tuition, but apparently also to give their kids money for whatever personal expenses came up, with no questions asked. Personal expenses here refer to things like weekend ski trips, ridiculously expensive stereo systems, fraternity parties with fully stocked wet bars, etc. Not to mention that the entire campus was less than 2 acres, and yet most of the students had their own cars, which it also cost $400 per semester to park in one of the college lots. It was all pretty incredible. In many respects, the college was my introduction to the stark realities of class, economic stratification, and the very different financial realities that different sorts of Americans inhabited. Some of these upper-class students were indeed spoiled, cretinous, and/or untroubled by questions of ethics. Others were under great family pressure and failing, for whatever reasons, to work up to what their parents considered their true grade potential. Some just didn't manage their time and responsibilities well and found themselves up against the wall on an assignment. I'm sure you get the basic picture. Let's just say that as a way of positioning myself to pay off some of my loans at an accelerated rate, I provided a certain service. This service was not cheap, but I was quite good at it and careful. E.g., I always demanded a large enough sample of the client's prior writing to determine how he tended to think and sound. and I never made the mistake of delivering something that was unrealistically superior to someone's own previous work. You can probably also see why these sorts of exercises would be good apprentice training for someone interested in so-called creative writing. Note. Which, FYI, there were few or no formal classes in at the time. End note. The enterprise's proceeds were invested in a high-yield money market account, and interest rates at that time were high, whereas student loans don't even start accruing interest until one leaves school. The overall strategy was conservative, both financially and academically. It's not as if I was doing several of these commissioned fictional pieces a week or anything. I had plenty of my own work to do too, after all. To anticipate a likely question, let me concede that the ethics here were grey at best. This is why I chose to be honest, just above, about not being impoverished or needing the extra income in order to eat or anything. I was not desperate. I was, though, trying to accumulate some savings against what I anticipated, note, correctly it turned out, end note, to be debilitating postgrad debt. I am aware that this is not an excuse in the strict sense, but I do believe it serves as at least an explanation. And there were also other more general factors in context that might be seen as mitigating. For one, the college itself turned out to have a lot of moral hypocrisy about it, e.g., congratulating itself on its diversity and the leftist piety of its politics, while in reality going about the business of preparing elite kids to enter elite professions and make a great deal of money, thus increasing the pool of prosperous alumni donors. Without anyone ever discussing it or even allowing themselves to be aware of it, the college was a veritable temple of mammon. I'm not kidding. For instance, the most popular major was economics, and the best and brightest of my class all seemed obsessed with a career on Wall Street, whose own public ethos at the time was greed is good. Not to mention that there were retail cocaine dealers on campus who made a lot more than I ever did. Those were just a few of what I might, if I chose, offer as extenuating factors. My own attitude about it was detached and professional, not unlike a lawyer's. The basic view I held was that whereas there may have been elements of my enterprise that might technically qualify as aiding or abetting a client's decision to violate the college's code of academic honesty, that decision, as well as the practical and moral responsibility for it, rested with the client. I was undertaking certain freelance writing assignments for pay. Why certain students wanted certain papers of a certain length on certain topics, and what they chose to do with them after delivery, were not my business. Suffice it to say that this view was not shared by the college's judicial board in late 1984. Here the story gets complex and a bit lurid, and an SOP memoir would probably linger on the details and the rank unfairness and hypocrisies involved. I'm not going to do that. I am, after all, mentioning all this only to provide some context for the ostensibly fictional-looking formal elements of the non-SOP memoir that you have, I hope, bought and are now enjoying. Plus, of course, also to help explain what I was even doing in one of the most tedious and drone-like white-collar jobs in America during what should have been my junior year at an elite college. Note, junior year, by the way, was when many of the college's other more privileged students, including several who'd been my freelance clients, were enjoying their traditional semester abroad at places like Cambridge and the Sorbonne. I'm just mentioning this. There's no expectation that you're going to wring your hands over whatever hypocrisy and unfairness you may discern in this state of affairs. In no sense is this forward a bid for sympathy. Plus, it's all water long under the bridge now, obviously. End note. So that this obvious question isn't left to hang distractingly all through the book, a type of distraction I personally despise as a reader. Given these limited objectives, then, the whole code of debacle is probably best sketched in broad schematic strokes. To wit, 1a, naive people are, more or less, by definition, unaware that they're naive. 1b, I was, in retrospect, naive. 2, for various personal reasons, I was not a member of any campus fraternity, and so was ignorant of many of the bizarre tribal customs and practices in the college's so-called Greek community. 3a, one of the college's fraternities had instituted the phenomenally stupid and short-sighted practice of placing behind their billiard room's wet bar a 2-drawer file cabinet containing copies of certain recent exams, problem sets, lab reports, and term papers that had earned high grades, which were available for plagiarism. 3b. Speaking of phenomenally stupid, it turned out that not just one, but 3 different members of his fraternity had, without bothering to consult the party from whom they'd commissioned and received them, tossed papers that were not technically their own into this communal file cabinet. 4. The paradox of plagiarism is that it actually requires a lot of care and hard work to pull off successfully, since the original text style, substance, and logical sequences have to be modified enough so that the plagiarism isn't totally insultingly obvious to the professor who's grading it. 5a. The type of spoiled, cretinous frat boy who goes into a communal file cabinet for a term paper on the use of implicit GMP price deflators in macroeconomic theory is also the type who will not know or care about the paradoxical extra work that good plagiarism requires. He will, however incredible it sounds, just plunk down and retype the thing word for word. 5b. Nor, even more incredibly, will he take the trouble to verify that none of his fraternity brothers is planning to plagiarize the same term paper for the same course. 6. The moral system of a college fraternity turns out to be classically tribal, i.e. characterized by a deeply felt sense of honor, discretion, and loyalty to one's so-called brothers, coupled with a complete sociopathic lack of regard for the interests or even humanity of anyone outside that fraternal set. Let's just end the sketch there. I doubt you need a whole diagram to anticipate what came down, nor much of a primer in US class dynamics to understand of the eventual 5 students placed on academic probation or forced to retake certain courses versus the 1 student formally suspended, pending consideration of expulsion and possible, note, but highly unlikely given the college's concern with its reputation and PR, end note, referral of the case to the Hampshire County District Attorney. Which one of these was yours truly? The living author, Mr. David Wallace of Philo, Illinois, to which tiny, lifeless, nothing town neither I nor my family were at all psyched about the prospect of having me return and sit around watching TV for the at least 1 and possibly 2 semesters that the college's administration was going to take its sweet time considering my fate. Note. Sorry about that text sentence. The truth is that the whole frat cabinet and cascading scandals need for a scapegoat situation still sometimes gets me jacked up, emotionally speaking. 2 facts might make the durability of these emotions easier to understand. A. Of the 5 other students found by the J-Board to have either bought term papers or plagiarized from those who had, 2 ended up graduating magna cum laude. And B. A third now serves on the college's board of trustees. I'll just leave those as stark facts and let you draw your own conclusions about the whole shabby affair. Mendicem Memorum esse oportet. End note. Meanwhile, by the terms of the 1966 Federal Claims Collection Acts, Section 106 CD, the repayment clock on my guaranteed student loan started running, as of 1st January 1985, at 6% interest. Again, if any of that seems vague or ablated, it's because I'm giving you a very stripped-down, mission-specific version of just who and where I was, life situation-wise, for the 13 months I spent as an IRS examiner. Moreover, I'm afraid that just how I landed in this government post at all is a background item that I can explain only obliquely, i.e. by ostensibly explaining why I can't discuss it. Note. And please forgive the contrivance here. Given the familio-legal strictures detailed just below, this kind of anti-explanation is the only permissible way for me to avoid having my whole presence at IRS Post 047 be some enormous, unexplained, and unmotivated blank, which in certain types of fiction might be technically okay, but in a memoir would constitute a deep and essential breach of contract. End note. First, I'd ask you to bear in mind the above-cited disinclination to have me return and serve out my limbo at home in Philo, which mutual reluctance in turn involves a whole lot of issues and history between my family and me that I couldn't get into even if I wanted to. See below. Second, I would inform you that the city of Peoria, Illinois, is roughly 90 miles from Philo, which is a distance that permits general familial monitoring without any of the sort of detailed close-quarters knowledge that might confer feelings of concern or responsibility. Third, I could direct your attention to Congress's 1977 Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, Section 1101, which turns out to override the Federal Claims Collection Act, Section 106CD, and to authorize deferment of guaranteed student loan repayments for documented employees of certain government agencies, including, guess which one? Fourth, I am allowed, after exhaustive negotiations with the Publishers' Council, to say that my 13-month contract, posting, and GS9 civil service pay grade were the result of certain sub rosa actions on the part of a certain unnamed relative. Note, not a parent, end note, with unspecified connections to the Midwest Regional Commissioner's Office of a certain unnamed government agency. Last and most important, I am also permitted to say, albeit in language not wholly my own, that members of my family were almost unanimous in declining to sign the legal releases required for any further or more specific use, mention, or representation of the aforesaid relatives, or any likeness thereof in any capacity, setting, form, or guise, inclusive of references sine damno within the written work heretofore entitled The Pale King, and that this is why I can't get into anything more specific about the overall hows and whys. End of explanation of absence of real explanation, which, however irksome or opaque it may come off, is, again, still preferable to having the question of why, how I was working at the Midwest Regional Examination Center just hang there, huge and unaddressed throughout the whole text to follow. Note. QV, FN2, supra, endnote. Like the proverbial elephant in the room. Here I should also probably address one other core motivation type question that bears on the matter of veracity and trust, raised several paragraphs above, viz. Why a non-fiction memoir at all, since I'm primarily a fiction writer. Not to mention the question of why a memoir restricted to a single, long past year I spent in exile from anything I even remotely cared about or was interested in, serving out time as little more than one tiny ephemeral drone-like cog in an immense federal bureaucracy. Note. The word bureaucracy is, notwithstanding that part of the run-up to the whole new IRS thing, was an increasing anti- or post-bureaucratic mentality on the part of both 666 and Region. I don't think that sentence makes sense. See, for one quick example, this snippet from an interview with Mr. Donald James, a GS13 team leader in the Midwest RAC's FATS group from 1984 through 1990. Perhaps it would help to define bureaucracy, the term, what we're talking about. All they said you had to do was refer to the dictionary. Administration characterized by diffusion of authority and adherence to inflexible rules of operation, unquote. Inflexible rules of operation. An administrative system in which the need or desire to follow complex procedures impedes effective action, unquote. They had transparencies of the definition projected up on the wall during meetings. They said he had them all recite them as nearly some type of catechism. Meanwhile, in discursive terms, that the couple of years in question here saw one of the largest bureaucracies anywhere undergo a convulsion in which it tried to reconceive itself as a non- or even anti-bureaucracy, which at first might sound like nothing more than an amusing bit of bureaucratic folly. In fact, it was frightening. It was a little like watching an enormous machine come to consciousness and start trying to think and feel like a real human. The terror of concurrent films like Terminator and Blade Runner was based around just this premise. But of course, in the case of the service, the convulsions and fallout, although more diffuse and undramatic, had an actual impact on Americans' lives. NB. Mr. Jones's they is referring to certain high-level figures who were exponents of the so-called initiative, which it is totally impractical here to try to explain abstractly, although QV item 951458221 of section 14, interview documentary, which consists of a long and probably not ideally focused version of such an explanation from Mr. Kenneth. Type of thing Ken Hindle, one of the oldest wigglers in the Rotes group to which I ended up, after a great deal of initial confusion and misassignment, being tasked, except to say that the only such figure anyone at our low level ever even laid eyes on was the technical branch's M.E. Laurel and his strange team of intuitives and occult ephebes, who were, it emerged, tasked to help implement the initiative as it pertained to examinations. If that doesn't make any sense at this point, please don't worry about it. I went back and forth on the issue of what to explain here versus what to let unfold in a more natural, dramatic way in the memoir itself. I finally decided to offer certain quick, potentially confusing explanations, betting that if they're too obscure or baroque right now, you just won't pay much attention to them, which, again, I hasten to assure you is totally okay. End note. There are two different kinds of valid answer here, one being personal and the other more literary humanistic. The personal stuff, it's initially tempting to say, is just none of your business. Except that one disadvantage of addressing you here directly and in person in the cultural present of 2005 is the fact that, as both you and I know, there is no longer any kind of clear line between personal and public, or rather between private versus performative. Among obvious examples are weblogs, reality television, cell phone cameras, chat rooms, not to mention the dramatically increased popularity of the memoir as a literary genre. Of course, popularity is in this context a synonym for profitability, and actually that fact alone should suffice, personal motivation-wise. Consider that in 2003, the average author's advance, note, if you're interested, this term is shorthand for an unrefundable advance payment against the author's projected royalties through a 7.5% to 15% set of progressive margins on sales of a book. Since actual sales are difficult to predict, it is in the writer's financial interest to receive the largest possible advance, even though the lump sum payment can create tax problems for the year of receipt, thanks largely to the 1986 Tax Reform Act's elimination of income averaging. And given again that predicting actual sales is an inexact science, the size of the upfront author advance that a publishing company is willing to pay for the rights to a book is the best tangible indication of the publisher's willingness to support that book, with the latter term meaning everything from the number of copies printed to the size of the marketing budget. And this support is practically the only way for a book to gain the attention of a mass audience and to garner significant sales. Like it or not, that's just the commercial reality today. End note. The average author's advance for a memoir was almost 2.5 times that paid for a work of fiction. The simple truth is that I, like so many other Americans, have suffered reverses in the volatile economy of the last few years, and these reverses have occurred at the same time that my financial obligations have increased, along with my age and responsibilities. Note: by age 40, artist or no, the reality is that only an imprudent chump would neglect to start saving and investing for eventual retirement, especially in this era of tax-deferred IRA and SEP IRA plans with such generous annual tax-exempt caps, and extra especially if you can S-corp yourself and let the corporation make an additional annual pension contribution over and above your IRA as a contractual employee benefit, thereby exempting that extra amount from your taxable income too. The tax laws right now are practically down on one knee, begging upper-income Americans to take advantage of this provision. The trick, of course, is earning enough to qualify as an upper-income American. Deos fortioribus adesse. End note. And meanwhile, all sorts of US writers, some of whom I know personally, including one I actually had to lend money to for basic living expenses as late as spring 2001, have recently hit it big with memoirs. Note: despite his sudden celebrity and windfall, I am still, almost 4 years later, awaiting repayment of the loan's principal from this unnamed writer, which I mention not to whinge or be vindictive, but merely as one more small part of my financial condition qua motivation, end note. And I would be a rank hypocrite if I pretended that I was less attuned and receptive to market forces than anyone else. As all mature people know, though, it's possible for very different kinds of motives and emotions to coexist in the human soul. There is no way that a memoir like The Pale King could be written solely for financial gain. One paradox of professional writing is that books written solely for money and or acclaim will almost never be good enough to garner either. The truth is that the larger narrative encompassing this forward has significant social and artistic value. That might sound conceited, but rest assured that I wouldn't and couldn't have put 3 years hard labor plus an additional 15 months of legal and editorial futzing into The Pale King if I were not convinced it was true. Have, e.g., a look at the following, which was transcribed verbatim from remarks by Mr. DeWitt Glendening Jr., the director of the Midwest Regional Examination Center, during most of my tenure there. If you know the position a person takes on taxes, you can determine his whole philosophy. The tax code, once you get to know it, embodies all the essence of human life: greed, politics, power, goodness, charity. To these qualities that Mr. Glendening ascribed to the code, I would respectfully add one more: boredom, opacity, user unfriendliness. This all can be put another way. It might sound a bit dry and wonkish, but that's because I'm boiling it down to the abstract skeleton. 1985 was a critical year for American taxation and for the Internal Revenue Service's enforcement of the US tax code. In brief, that year saw not only fundamental changes in the service's operational mandate, but also the climax of an involved intra-service battle Between advocates and opponents of an increasingly automated, computerized tax system, for complex administrative reasons, the Midwest Regional Examination Center became one of the venues in which this battle's crucial phase played out. But that's only part of it. As alluded to in an FN way above, subtending this operational battle over human versus digital enforcement of the tax code was a deeper conflict over the very mission and raison of the service. A conflict whose fallout extended from the corridors of power at Treasury and 666 all the way down to the most staid and backwater district office. At the highest levels, the struggle here was between traditional or conservative, note, meaning somewhat confusingly classically liberal, end note, officials who saw tax and its administration as an arena of social justice and civic virtue, on the one hand, and those more progressive, pragmatic policymakers who prized the market model, efficiency, and a maximum return on the investment of the service's annual budget. Distilled to its essence, the question was whether, and to what extent, the IRS should be operated like a for-profit business. Probably that's all I should say right here in terms of summary. If you know how to search and parse government archives, you can find voluminous history and theory on just about every side of the debate. It's all in the public record. But here's the thing, both then and now, very few ordinary Americans know anything about all this, nor much about the deep changes the service underwent in the mid-1980s, changes that today directly affect the way citizens' tax obligations are determined and enforced. And the reason for this public ignorance is not secrecy. Despite the IRS's well-documented paranoia and aversion to publicity, note, attitudes that are not wholly unjustified given TP's hostility to the service, politicians' habit of bashing the agency to score populist points, etc., end note, secrecy here had nothing to do with it. The real reason why US citizens are not aware of these complex changes and stakes is that the whole subject of tax policy and administration is dull, massively, spectacularly dull. It is impossible to overstate the importance of this feature. Consider, from the service's perspective, the advantages of the dull, the arcane, the mind-numbingly complex. The IRS was one of the very first government agencies to learn that such qualities help insulate them against public protest and political opposition, and that abstruse dullness is actually a much more effective shield than is secrecy. For the great disadvantage of secrecy is that it's interesting. People are drawn to secrets. They can't help it. Keep in mind that the period we're talking about was only a decade after Watergate. Had the service tried to hide or cover up its conflicts and convulsions, some enterprising journalist could have done an expose that drew a lot of attention and interest and scandalous fuss. But this is not at all what happened. What happened was that much of the high-level policy debate played out for 2 years in full public view, e.g. in open hearings of the Joint Committee on Taxation, the Senate Treasury Procedures and Statutes Subcommittee, and the IRS's Deputy and Assistant Commissioners Council. These hearings were collections of anaerobic men in drab suits who spoke of verbless bureaucracies, terms like strategic utilization template and revenue vector in place of plan and tax, and took days just to reach consensus on the order of items for discussion. Even in the financial press, there was hardly any coverage. Can you guess why? If not, consider the fact that just about every last transcript, record, study, white paper, code amendment, revenue ruling, and procedural memo has been available for public perusal since date of issue. No FOIA filing even required. But not one journalist seems ever to have checked them out, and with good reason. The stuff is solid rock. The eyes roll up white by the third or fourth paragraph. You just have no idea. Note, I'm reasonably sure that I am the only living American who's actually read all these archives all the way through. I'm not sure I can explain how I did it. Mr. Chris Aquistapace, one of the GS11 chalk leaders in our rote exams group, and a man of no small intuition and sensitivity, proposed an analogy between the public records surrounding the initiative and the giant solid gold Buddhas that flanked certain temples in ancient Khmer. These priceless statues, never guarded or secured, were safe from theft, not despite, but because of their value. They were too huge and heavy to move. Something about this sustained me. End note. Fact. The birth agonies of the new IRS led to one of the great and terrible PR discoveries in modern democracy, which is that if sensitive issues of governance can be made sufficiently dull and arcane, there will be no need for officials to hide or dissemble, because no one not directly involved will pay enough attention to cause trouble. No one will pay attention because no one will be interested, because, more or less a priori, of these issues' monumental dullness. Whether this PR discovery is to be regretted for its corrosive effect on the democratic ideal or celebrated for its enhancement of government efficiency depends, it seems, on which side one takes in the deeper debate over ideals versus efficacy, referenced on page 82, resulting in yet another involuted loop that I won't tax your patience by trying to trace out or make hay of. To me, at least in retrospect, note, which is, after all, Memoir's speciality, end note. The really interesting question is why dullness proves to be such a powerful impediment to attention. Why we recoil from the dull. Maybe it's because dullness is intrinsically painful. Maybe that's where phrases like deadly dull or excruciatingly dull come from. But there might be more to it. Maybe dullness is associated with psychic pain because something that's dull or opaque fails to provide enough stimulation to distract people from some other deeper type of pain that is always there, if only in an ambient, low-level way, and which most of us, note, whether or not we're consciously aware of it, end note, spend nearly all our time and energy trying to distract ourselves from feeling, or at least from feeling directly or with our full attention. Admittedly, the whole thing's pretty confusing and hard to talk about abstractly, but surely something must lie behind not just muzak in dull or tedious places anymore, but now also actual TV in waiting rooms, supermarkets checkouts, airports gates, SUVs backseats, Walkman, iPods, Blackberries, cell phones that attach to your head. This terror of silence with nothing diverting to do. I can't think anyone really believes that today's so-called information society is just about information. Everyone knows, note, again, whether consciously or not, end note, it's about something else, way down. The memoir relevant point here is that I learned in my time with the service something about dullness, information, and irrelevant complexity. About negotiating boredom as one would a terrain, its levels and forests, and endless wastes. Learned about it extensively, exquisitely, in my interrupted year. And now, ever since that time, have noticed, at work and in recreation and time with friends and even the intimacies of family life, that living people do not speak much of the dull, of those parts of life that are and must be dull. Why this silence? Maybe it's because the subject is, in and of itself, dull. Only then we're again right back where we started, which is tedious and irksome. There may, though, I opine, be more to it, as in vastly more, right here before us, hidden by virtue of its size.